Hey, Mate 40 here. So I'm just curious, do you keep a special room in your home that you just solely reserve for watching this show? Or do you put on special garments? For example, do you put on your Sunday best when watching this show? Or do you... Right, and have you ever considered just writing me a letter while you watch this show, or let me know what activities you engage in when you watch this show? Or is there a particular art that you like to have nearby, or are there particular drinks that you like to engage in, or are there particular tasks that you like to launch into while watching this show? I'd like to think that there's a special room in your home that's solely reserved for watching my show, and that there are special garments that you put on that would properly accord the solemnity of what we're doing here. All right, I'd like to think that my soul is connecting with your soul, and this kind of soul connection is easier when we make it physical, when you have, concrete commitments and concrete expressions of your devotion to this show, such as a particular room in your home or particular works of art that you'd like to have nearby when you're enjoying this show. I'm reading a new book by David Sanger. It's about the new Cold Wars, China's rise, Russia's invasion, and America's struggle to defend the West. It was released April 16, 2024, and there was a bit in here that made me chuckle. Talking about Ukraine's revolution in 2014, which overthrew a democratically elected pro-Russia leader. And it was classic Joe Biden, right? Classic Biden. And so what do you think is classic Biden? Right, David Sanger writes, he inserted himself into a complex dispute half a world away, convinced that his long experience in diplomacy and personal touch could make a difference. Like a hostage negotiator, Biden was trying to build a rapport with the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, even as he tried to talk him down to convince him to take a deal that the European Union, along with the Russians, had brokered to guarantee elections by the end of 2014 and end the crisis. All right, so classic Joe Biden, right, sticking himself into complex disputes that are way out of his IQ level to solve. Very different from the reactions of a much more intelligent man, right, Barack Obama. So for President Obama in 2014, the urgent question was how to respond to Russia's move into Crimea as a clear violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. But Obama resisted those in his administration, such as Victoria Nuland, the Russia hawk, who was serving as Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. All right, she was pressing him to act. Biden was eager to make Moscow pay in blood and money, all right, for moving into Crimea back in 2014. Right, Obama resisted the effort. Much wiser man than Joe Biden. Don't get me into a war with Russia, he warned his aides repeatedly. That, first and foremost, was his goal, and that should be any American president's goal. Such a war would not only be a new conflict with potentially unimaginable consequences for the United States, right? It's a different calculus taking on a nuclear-armed state. It would become a fundamentally losing battle. And Obama was absolutely right. He told his aides that Russia would always care more about the Ukrainians than Americans would. Intervention would have been a violation of the guiding principle of foreign policy that he once boiled down for reporters on Air Force One into one pithy phrase: don't do stupid shit. Right, that was Barack Obama's foreign policy. Fate of Crimea, Obama determined, was important, but hardly a core U.S. security interest. It had nothing to do with U.S. security, just like the Gaza conflict has nothing to do with U.S. security. Right, the welfare of Americans is completely unchanged no matter what goes on in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In public, Obama sought to downplay both the geopolitical significance and the impact that U.S. involvement would have. Ukraine, which is a non-NATO country, is going to be vulnerable to military domination by Russia no matter what we do. All right, think about how much wiser Barack Obama was than Joe Biden. In Belgium, less than a week after the annexation, Obama had already made up his mind. This is not another Cold War that we're entering into. Unlike the Soviet Union, Russia leads no bloc of nations, no global ideology. So Barack Obama, all right, considerably wiser when it came to foreign policy than Joe Biden. Good article here in Foreign Policy magazine. Americans don't want a wartime president. This is Mark Hanna writing. If Biden can avoid the temptation to be a warrior defending allies abroad, he might have a better chance at winning his battles at home. So Foreign Policy is a 99% liberal left publication. Right, only on the rarest of occasions do they publish anything on the right. So U.S. President Joe Biden pitches his bid for re-election as a defense of American democracy itself. Remember, for the first 2 years of his reign, he talked about the great struggle between democracies and autocracies. Well, he stopped talking that way, but what a ludicrous conception of U.S. foreign policy, right? What a ludicrous mission to put the U.S. on, because there are going to be times when, right, autocracies are going to better serve American interests, right, than a democracy, right? And press 1 in the chat if you've ever rubbed one out while watching this show. Press 2 if you've ever rubbed one out to listening to imagining Richard Spencer's face looking down at you. All right, Joe Biden is creating a strategy of portraying himself as a bulwark of democracy, not just at home, but across the globe. All right, he's supporting wars in Ukraine and the Middle East that are going to keep grinding on through and past Election Day. All right, this is a strategic mistake. Right, and these authors and this publication desperately wants Joe Biden to win against Donald Trump. So at his State of the Union in March, Biden warned that U.S. democracy is under assault, but he dilutes his message by swiftly tying that to attacks on democracy overseas by referring to Russia's invasion of Ukraine into, a powerful political issue for Americans. It is not. So Biden's administration rhetoric just keeps upping the ante. Right? It claims that the war in Ukraine is not simply a regional conflict with a particular historical origin, but is part of an existential global battle between democracy and autocracy. Right? He insists on framing things ideologically, and he just doesn't know what he's talking about. Right? So when the author tells the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, that Joe Biden's framing distorts the essential nature of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that the ideological framing of democracy versus autocracy comes straight from Joe Biden. So why is Joe Biden waging an international crusade for democracy? Right, because he is delusional, all right? Because he is completely out of touch with reality, and he imagines himself and his capabilities as much greater than they are. And Americans are not eager for their country to act as the sword and shield of democracy overseas. All right? Americans don't care about the war in Ukraine, and frankly, they don't really care that much about the war in Gaza. Right? Americans want Washington to avoid escalation into wars overseas. All right? Ukrainian morale and momentum is sagging. Putin is reportedly seeking a ceasefire. Right? There's broad support in the United States and in Europe for a negotiated settlement, right? But Joe Biden is still pushing this war forward, right? It's insane, right? Americans don't want the United States to be so excessively involved overseas at the cost of our own well-being and at the cost of our own finances and the cost of American lives. Right? So there's no reason for the United States to remain in NATO compared to the reasons for getting out. Right? The United States should place its priority on keeping China in check. Right? What Israel does versus Hamas, right, doesn't affect American welfare. So I don't think Americans should be funding Israel. I don't think Americans should be subsidizing Israel. Like, Israel should stand on its own 2 feet. Okay, what the heck's going on in the news?
We'll be focusing on political retribution of his enemies. I'm concerned.
Uh-oh. All right, let's get a burst from Fox.
Welcome to Jesse Waters Primetime. Tonight, He wants to put them all in jail. Who wants to put them before firing squads?
He will be focusing on political retribution of his enemies.
I'm concerned for myself. I'm concerned for my family.
The revenge tour, a hoax or not?
Number one, they're wrong. It has to stop.
I'm Cosmo, Jerry. I'm Cosmo Kramer, and that's who I'm going to be. From now on, I'm Cosmo.
Meeting the man behind Kramer. Michael Richards joins Primetime.
It's a Festivus miracle.
On beaches called Utah and Omaha, and Sword and Gold and Juneau, they come ashore.
80 years since D-Day, Gary Sinise is here.
Lieutenant Barry, what are you doing here?
Plus,
where's Hunter?
He's a bad boy.
New hoax alert. New hoax alert. New hoax alert.
ladies and gentlemen, we have another hoax. Hot off the press from the Biden campaign, quote, Donald Trump confirms plans to jail opponents. Biden's now accusing Donald Trump of doing exactly what he did. Naturally, the campaign coordinated the hoax with the media. We woke up this morning to headlines like these. The New York Times, Trump vows to prosecute rivals, put rule of law on the ballot. Trump vows legal revenge against enemies. Trump wants retribution. That's dangerous, unlawful, and un-American. The guy who got a thrill up his leg is now getting a chill.
Donald Trump, who wants to put them before firing squads, basically. He wants to put them all in jail. He's unbelievable the way he talks about his opponents. I'm telling you, Trump could end up rolling the score. I've got the Congress. I've got the Supreme Court. I own it all. I am a dictator.
Firing squads? When did Trump say firing squads? He didn't. This is what sparked their hoax. Watch.
Focus on those that want people to believe that you want retribution, that you will use the system of justice to go after your political enemies.
So, number one, they're wrong. It has to stop, because otherwise we're not going to have a country. Look, when this election is over, based on what they've done, I would have every right to go after them. We can't have this stuff go on, because you know what? When Biden goes out, everyone says bye-bye, and then he gets indicted 2 days later, and they go after him. The country doesn't want that. And you know what? They didn't want.
Okay, Stephen Walt writes here in Foreign Policy magazine, Biden's foreign policy problem is incompetence. The U.S. military's collapsed pier in Gaza is symbolic of a much bigger issue. Right, so we have spent $300 million, right, talk about an expensive PR stunt, building a pier to send aid to people in Gaza, all right? And we've managed to deliver 60 truckloads of aid before rough seas damaged the structure and aid deliveries had to be suspended. Right, so we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this pier that doesn't even work, right? But it's part of a larger problem of U.S. incompetence in our overseas intervention, right? 1960s and 70s, right? Smart people understood that South Vietnam had no intrinsic strategic value, and yet our leaders insisted that we couldn't withdraw short of victory because it would cast doubt on our staying power and undermine our credibility and encourage our allies around the world, right, to side with the communists. But that's completely bogus. American power does not depend upon pronouncements and interventions overseas, all right? American power depends upon its economy and its military. We spend more on defense than every other country in the world put together, right? So there's a fetishizing of credibility with people who want some highly interventionist foreign policy, right? And our dominant foreign policy establishment that's embodied by idiots like Joe Biden, right, believe that if we simply try hard enough, we can meet any goal. But people who live there, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Gaza, all right, they're going to have far more to say, and they're going to have far more consequential actions with regard to their home than anything that we can do. Right? So seeing credibility and influence solely as a matter of will overlooks another key ingredient, which is more important, and that is competence. Josh Randall says, my perfectly reasonable call to prayer was censored from the chat. Later, bros. Absolutely hate this site with all my being. If the main institutions charged with conducting American foreign relations, the National Security Council, the Department of State, Defense, Treasury, Commerce, Intelligence Services, various congressional committees, are not very competent, right? All the will in the world will not convince others to take our advice. So think about the Berlin airlift in 1948. All right, it was a clear signal of Western resolve, but it would have backfired if the United States and its partners would not have been able to pull off the Berlin airlift. All right, we were able to undergo this complicated logistical effort. We were able to send man to the moon when we were much more trusting and cohesive and homogeneous society, right? When we restricted immigration in 1924, we launched 4 decades of unparalleled American success, American dominance, American prosperity, American military might, and American technological breakthroughs, right? When we were more cohesive, more trusting society, and we just cut off immigration. Since 1964, we've turned the taps up on immigration. Tens of millions of people have flooded in here. As a result, we have considerably diminished quality of life, much less social trust and social cohesion, right? We can't fulfill the lofty goals that we usually set for ourselves in foreign policy. Like, we lose every war since Vietnam, unless it's with some total loser state. Right? We have these lofty plans, and nothing tends to come from them. Josh Randall texts me, boycott YouTube, bro, it serves Satan. Bro, you can go on Rumble, or you can make comments on X. You can speak freely on Odyssey. All right, so I'm streaming simultaneously right now over many different platforms. So go join some of the other platforms. All right, speak freely on Rumble, speak freely on Odyssey, speak freely on DLive, speak freely on X. Where else am I going out? YouTube, DLive. Oh, Kick. You can speak freely on Kick. So that's kick.com/Luke Ford, right? Speak freely on Kick. So 5 different outlets that you can speak freely on when I stream this show. All right, we have taken all these steps to create a two-state solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has never worked out. We accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in a clumsy and avoidable war over Kosovo in 1999. We had all the policy errors and intelligence failures that enabled the 9/11 attacks. So that's a little bit like Israel on October 7th. Like, Israel was incredibly incompetent. If they'd been competent, they could have slashed the Hamas invasion and just slaughtered the Hamas invaders, but Israel was incompetent. As a result, 1,200 Israelis died. And you know what? Dozens, if not hundreds, of those Israelis were killed by quote-unquote friendly fire. It took the IDF 3 days to repel the Hamas invaders. Hamas invaders got halfway to the West Bank. And so in their response, right, the IDF was incredibly incompetent, like slaughtering dozens of Israelis while trying to fight back Hamas. If Israel had simply defended itself competently, they wouldn't have been dragged into this morass in Gaza. And so forget about the 35,000 dead Gazans and the hundreds of dead Israelis, right? Israel would not be sunk in an absolute morass in Gaza if they'd simply taken care of the border. So too the United States, if they'd simply taken care of the border, right? Racially profiled people getting on planes, right? To the extent that that is a useful enforcement strategy. Right? If the United States had simply been competent with regard to these terror threats, right, we would not have been prompted into those disastrous wars of invading Afghanistan and Iraq. So we're incompetent defending our own interests, and then we overreact. We get into the 2008 financial crisis. We have all these scandals and collisions at sea involving the U.S. Navy. Right? As the U.S. military becomes more diverse, it simultaneously becomes less competent and less trusting. Right? We've got a bloated defense procurement process that can't pass an audit, that buys aircraft that are rarely ready for action. All right, we thought that economic sanctions would destroy the Russian economy. Didn't happen. All right, we encourage Ukraine to engage in their doomed 2023 counteroffensive that killed just thousands upon thousands of Ukrainians. So now that we've got a big crowd, tell me, do you reserve a special room in your home for watching this show, where you only enter that room to watch this show? And tell me about the special garments that you put on, right, when you watch this show. Do you dress up in your Sunday best? So what the heck? Right, the U.S. doesn't fail at everything, but most of our overseas intervention has just been disastrous. And this reminds me of a hugely consequential article that I read back in the fall of 1986. I started reading the New Republic, and I came across this essay titled, "Shut Up, Senator Biden." And it was by the ABC national news correspondent of the time, Brit Hume. Like, whoa, like it was amazing to me that a national correspondent for a major network, right, could write an article in the New Republic that was so lively, but it was so apropos. It was so much fun to read. I've never forgotten that article. I could tell you the title of that article over the past 30 years, and it's always been the prism through which I've understood Joe Biden, because it works. It sums him up, right? Shut up, Senator Biden. The guy is just a motor mouth, and has considerable exaggerated sense of his own competence. So back in 2020, Brit Hume tweeted, "My article on Joe Biden as he was about to run for president 33 years ago, which I told him he is a windbag." He took that with good humor. I think it's a balanced piece that the editor promoted it on the cover with the line, "Shut up, Senator Biden." So I've never forgot this essay. It just left an indelible impression. Never forgotten the headline. And another New Republic article that I remember from this time was "The Idiocy of Urban Life," and then it got a rejoinder essay, "The Idiocy of Rural Life." And that theme I've clashed with Elliot Blatt on this show many times. But anyway, here are some excerpts from this Brit Hume essay in the New Republic in 1986, and it still applies very keenly to Joe Biden. The rhetorical fervor of his stump speeches and his debating style have earned him the reputation of a man whose mouth runs and runs and runs well ahead of his mind. Right. When Joe Biden first learned this article had been commissioned, right, the senator, Joe Biden, telephoned the editor-in-chief of the New Republic, tried to have the assignment called off. When that failed, he first refused to sit for an interview. Then he only agreed to an informal chat over coffee. He says, "I want to find out why you don't like me." Brit Hume remembers this as an incredibly awkward and extraordinary conversation. Biden wants to know, does Brit Hume harbor deep personal antipathy to Joe Biden? No. Then what is it you don't like? Joe Biden asked. "Senator," came the reluctant reply, "I think you're a windbag." Biden seemed greatly relieved. He laughed and he said, "Yeah, there's truth to it." And he agreed to cooperate fully. So Joe Biden has long had a reputation among reporters for enjoying the sound of his own voice. Right, when he was at the confirmation hearing of Alexander Haig as Secretary of State, Biden took his entire first turn, 10 minutes, to ask a single question. When he was finished, nobody knew what the question was. Right, everybody laughed, including Joe Biden. In another foreign relations hearing, he went on at such length, late in a long session, the broadcast correspondents at the press table fashioned a white flag from a napkin and a microphone pole and waved it in the air. So, reminded of the incident back in 1986, Joe Biden said he knew he had a tendency to go on too long, but he had now curbed it. Right? So, all those character flaws that you believe you've curbed, in all likelihood, you haven't. Right? Joe Biden, completely delusional, thinking back in 1986 that he curbed his character flaw of being a windbag. Right? Joe Biden thinks out loud and then has difficulty figuring out what he thinks. And there are a lot of people like him. And there's been a growing movement of outrage in the chat that I have not played anything from Decoding the Gurus. So their latest edition, they decode Slavoj Žižek. So Richard Spencer talks about Žižek a lot. So Žižek is one of these colorful, dramatic characters, constantly seeking attention, who I just find incredibly annoying. He's a Marxist. I don't find redeeming quality in him, but this, rhetorical overstatement and dramatic gestures for attention is just what's so wearing about most of the people giving punditry on the right. So Richard Spencer loves Žižek because Žižek is a colorful, dramatic personality, much like Richard Spencer, constantly seeking attention, like a Nick Fuentes or a Ben Shapiro or a Dennis Prager, right? Constantly using rhetorical overstatement to say, look at me, look at me.
Both of them listen to the history of them. Both of them terrible events, right? And yet in hindsight, we look back on the American Civil War as being a kind of a necessary, it was devastating, but people look back at it as a necessary and ultimately a good thing.
That's what Aaron Bastani's asking, right? Like if you condemn revolutions, like during them, of course, terrible and, causing breakdown of society and stuff, but like, aren't they necessary at times when, the societies have gotten like this? And so if I interpreted what he said correctly, was like kind of, he would condemn Lenin, because Lenin also would have led to a repressive regime, even if he hadn't survived. I
read what he was saying as like you can't just point the finger at Stalin and say that Stalin hijacked a regime that was heading towards a nice democratic socialist, egalitarian and free kind of country that was ultimately liberating people, because it probably wasn't headed in that direction. Right. Yeah.
But so that first answer would seem to be sort of negative, and then the French Revolution one, he moves into this kind of response.
Sorry, I didn't make that clear. So were those mistakes? Should those not have happened? No, clearly there's a place for huge disruptive politics in history.
There is, but I think that I'm here simply a pessimist. That the way Hegel saw it correctly, no, you have to go through this terrorist moment, which fails, and then the true struggle begins. Will anything good survive from this? Hegel saw this very clearly. Well, he condemned the French terror, but he made it very clear that, nonetheless, a more liberal democratic order was possible only through that excessive moment. Or to give you another example that I like, I read a book, I forget which one, Old Senile, which deals with this problem and says, even if not actual violence, at moments of radical emancipation, you at least need a threat of more radical, deadly measure. For example, this guy looks at in the 60s, Martin Luther King, for full black emancipation, the struggles. And he said, why did Martin Luther, more or less, the struggle goes on, succeed? Because behind him there was a threat of much more violent radical blacks. Look at Mandela. The apartheid regime made a deal with him because they were afraid. There were much more radical blacks waiting.
This answer kind of like then, I mean, it's not inconsistent necessarily, but he is now switching to endorse the necessity. But wasn't he before saying V for Vendetta?
I'm just so tired of this florid, attention-seeking language that seems to be the mainstay of most of our pundits and gurus, right? Florid, attention-seeking language. You get it from Richard Spencer, from Ken Brown, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Brett and Eric Weinstein, Candace Owens, Dennis Prager. It reminds me of Tom Landry, who would always design trick plays for the playoffs because it was really important to him to look very intelligent. So as opposed to Chuck Noll, who just wanted to win Super Bowls and won 4 Super Bowls, Tom Landry only won 2 Super Bowls. And I'll never forget that first drive of the greatest Super Bowl ever when the Steelers defeated the Cowboys 35-31 in 1979. Cowboys got the ball first, and they just drive the ball down the field through their running game alone, right? They're just driving on Pittsburgh. It's the only drive in the whole game where they consistently succeed in running the ball on the Steelers. And then Tom Landry calls in a double reverse, and it's fumbled. The Steelers recover, and they go on to win the game. So, yeah, I tire of this florid attention-seeking.
Vendetta, that revolutionary moment is, it's just bullshit. But now he's saying the threat of violence and populist, uprisings are a very necessary part of any, revitalization or change. So, like, it feels...
Well, I feel like he's not doing with the question, but I'm very sympathetic to him here, Chris, because I feel like it's an impossible question. These great upheavals and revolutions often, there is a seesawing effect, and France ultimately, like it seesawed from over multiple revolutions and republics, and then another Bonaparte coming back, and then another king coming back. But it's sort of the oscillations evened out, and it kind of reconciled itself to somewhere, where it is now, which is it's not too bad.
So I don't know much about the French Revolution, the history of it, right? But I know you listen to a lot about it. But Robespierre, possibly filtered through, O'Fallon and all references. My image is that he is famous and like a complex historical figure. There's a magazine called the Jacobins, right, named after the movement that he was involved with and whatnot. But also that he was a tyrannical figure that killed a whole bunch of other people that he considered impure. So like he's famously a villainous character was the way that I understood as well. But in the way that Zizek talks about him, he kind of presents him as a like a good guy. And he's saying,
Yep.
yes, he did some, he was a bit like heavy-handed with the purges, but fundamentally, if you read his stuff before he died, he was still like an optimist or whatever.
No, look, I'm not qualified to give the definitive answer about Robespierre. I am aware that it's complicated, right? Like he said,
there's no good guys or bad guys, right?
Yeah.
So a friend of mine had a dilemma. He came across a bunch of middle-aged men discussing Israel and Gaza, predictable normie dialogue. Considered dropping a bunch of red pills on the conversation, then thought better of it and kept a noble silence. Good for you, mate.
Like they were to some degree idealists, and they were putting a lot of people to death. On the other hand, they were actually beset by traitors and enemies on all sides. And then later on, a lot of the people that were being put to death were the actual nasty people who were abusing their power, putting other people to death earlier on. And you could interpret it as this horrible circular firing squad, but also there was a kind of high-minded retribution there too. And I don't.
There's nothing good about being an idealist, right? Sometimes an idealist is a good thing, right? Frequently an idealist is a bad thing, right? Ideals is an extension of the word idea. And sometimes ideas are a force for good, and sometimes ideas are a force for ill. So having superb intentions and lofty ideals, right, is just as likely to create disaster as it is to enhance human goodness.
I don't know enough about the details to pass judgment on his character, but they were complicated characters. Like they were, in some ways, horrible, and in some ways, idealists. And
yeah, that's just the nature of history. I was just curious because it's clear in his commentary that he's regarding this as a provocative thing that he's saying, and it lined up as being provocative with what I vaguely have consumed about Robespierre through the culture, but I don't know enough to know if that's because of the culture war presentation of him.
I think it's generally, he's generally, like if you read a basic history book, he doesn't come off well. I'm aware that there are more detailed and nuanced kind of alternative readings. I don't know what the truth is, Chris.
Well, just to make your point maybe a bit stronger, Matt, and in favor of Zizek, the last time that he's asked the same question, because our understanding is kind of responding saying, okay, but let me just be clear what you're saying. And the third time, I think he gets an answer which points to the nuance that you've been emphasizing.
We were saying about, you said on the one hand, you're a law and order communist.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, you're saying that implicit within that for me is that you basically would discard any possibility of change through revolution. But now you're saying that actually
No. I just think we should judge it from case to case. For example, let's go to the literally burning Gaza question today, Hamas. I was boot out, attacked all around Germany, really covers.
Oh man, I got my timestamps wrong, because he talks in here, one of the hosts of Decoding the Gurus, talks in here about Haiti and how good it was that Haiti had a revolution and how wonderful that was. Well, Haiti's revolution was they killed all the whites, the first revolution, and then they asked the whites to come back, and then they slaughtered them all again. And Haiti has been nothing but a hellhole since they slaughtered all the whites on repeated occasions.
Sorry for just saying that I unconditionally reject what Hamas did. And this was not an empty phrase, because my Israeli friends who are left there, close to Palestinians, told me they knew people in that kibbutz and raving part. They were the best of.
This guy is just so florid. Yuck. But maybe there's something in what he's saying.
And to have everyone nodding along, but to actually give.
All right, that's Matthew Brown.
And I annoyed these people by making this point.
I don't want to.
Yeah, Žižek, like Richard Spencer and many other pundits, absolutely glory in annoying people.
Stereotype entire peoples, but I've met Eastern Europeans, and I've noticed this about them. They do enjoy this. Anyway, he fits with friends of mine in that sense, and that is an enjoyable aspect of his character.
Whoa, racial stereotypes here by Matthew Brown, Aussie psychologist, saying that Eastern Europeans enjoy irritating people.
And I think that's generally a good thing, right? Not to be wanting to make people feel comfortable and to have everyone nodding along, but to actually give, not to misrepresent what he thinks, but to give a version of what he thinks that is going to be troubling and cause the people that he's talking to I don't know. I guess he's hoping to react and reflect or, open their minds a bit more.
I think it actually is part of his philosophy, right? That he will do these transgressive acts to challenge people to recognize their ideologies, like how it's functioning, right? And he might overdo it at times. I'm not talking about like these specific examples. I've got many more where it's clear that like he regards himself as very provocative, and like he's constantly mentioning it's a little bit like if you want to be mean, you could say it's a bit like Jordan Peterson and Weinstein constantly talking about how they're being silenced and cancelled. But he's more playful with it. But he does throughout this, and it's actually been in some of the other clips. He'll constantly say, "I'm not allowed to talk to these people. These people were very annoyed when I said this," and I have many examples that we can move to.
No,
showing this.
it is a role that he likes to, like a cloak that he likes to draw around himself. Yeah, which is a bit like our other gurus, which is, I keep saying the unacceptable things. I've disappointed everyone, and there's some truth in it, I think, but it is also a shtick, and that's okay maybe.
But I think where he is a little bit different than some of the gurus who do the same pose is like he does go to venues and say things against the dominant ideology of that venue, whereas Brett Weinstein or whatever will go to a heterodox setting and they'll just say, or an anti-vax setting, and they'll say everything that everybody else there agrees. So whereas he kind of intentionally creates friction in whichever environment he's in, but in a playful way. Yeah. And I've got really good illustration of this.
Just before you do, Chris, there was something, I don't think you've got clips of it, but there was a topic that's a favorite of his that I wanted to ask you about. And one of the things he talks about is this idea of transgressive acts and ceremonies within an ideology. And again, just trying to paraphrasing very briefly Zizek's ideas here. The idea is that a dominant ideology is always going to have these aspects to it which are totally transgressive and inconsistent with its general purported beliefs and intents. Like an example would be, the West is all about open markets and promoting freedom and democracy around the world, very much against war and unprovoked aggression, but it will quite happily do drone strikes here, there, and everywhere, and doesn't condemn its allies in various parts of the world for unwarranted violence. And so he makes a lot of this, and he talks about like hazing rituals and as a rite of admission to various things. And it did. I mean, I don't know how much truth, like empirical truth, there is to his ideas, but it did make me think that perhaps the value in someone like Zizek, because at least he sort of makes you think. And I guess one of the things that made me think.
Oh, okay. I just don't find any value in Žižek, but good article in GQ. Why is everyone on steroids now? So let me just play a little bit here.
Work. He started supplementing with testosterone and eventually fell into what he described as the more is better trap, experimenting with anabolics on top of tea to get huge. Odd things started to happen. Not necessarily bad things. Women approached him in the grocery store and squeezed his arm. At investor conferences, he was mistaken for security. Today, still quite big, he saw insecurity in a lot of users' motivations. I think it's a personality thing, he said. I think a lot of men are attracted to trying to fix a hole in their ego. Others were chasing a long-lost feeling, said Jessica Cho.
Yeah, so some people get into radical politics, some people get into religion, other people get into steroids, right? People seek salvation in many different and bizarre ways, but these are all desperate attempts to fill a hole in the soul.
Who runs an integrative medicine practice in Los Angeles. She told me the question she hears from new patients is often the same. Can you make me feel like I'm 18 again? One of the biggest fights I have with patients is men wanting more testosterone, she said. They abuse it and then they give it to their friends. I cannot tame them. I make them sign a waiver saying if you abuse this outside my office, you're taken off. This is the one area in my whole practice where everything is about compliance. What patients sometimes fail to grasp, she says, is that testosterone doesn't operate in isolation. The endocrine system is similar to an orchestra, where hormones work together for balance, not cacophony. She mentioned she also saw a lot of renal issues in men from consuming too much protein and too many supplements. They're taking crazy amounts of supplements and their kidneys are getting knocked out. Researchers in the Netherlands have linked steroid use to left ventricular hypertrophy and impaired systolic and diastolic function. Steroid use has been connected to mood and anxiety disorders. In 2022, the Washington Post documented more than 24 bodybuilders who died young. Meanwhile, multiple experts told me there's a general lack of education around PEDs in the medical establishment. On top of that, there simply isn't enough good empirical data, extensive medical trials for a typical physician to consult, which perhaps leaves the average user, especially a new optimization-focused user, roaming around this nouveau Wild West, more open to bro science and harm. Reporting this story, I heard gnarly anecdotes of people getting conned, guys pinning themselves with bunk gear. And I heard from people with no complaints who loved their peptides, loved their tea. And I ran into anecdote after anecdote filled with dysmorphia and pain. What can we expect with normalization? Ideally, more education, more accurate information, and in a utopian world, an adult could make an informed decision about using PEDs with medical oversight. But right now, unless the laws change, that's not the case. One night after a series of interviews, I turned to my wife and said, I think this may be the saddest story I've ever done. Despite the warnings from doctors, the embrace of PEDs is a party that appears to be only growing. Next year, if organizers prevail in their plans, one of the wilder experiments in normalization will get underway, the Enhanced Games. The inaugural event is being planned with support from, among others...
Okay, Peter Thiel apparently is funding that. Let me just fast forward that section.
Drugs. Post-injection, he developed large lumps under his skin. I couldn't go over speed bumps in my car without wincing. Homemade steroids are a combination of a hormone powder, alcohol, and a carrier oil, where the powder gets dissolved and heated into a solution. Nick suspected the drugs he'd bought weren't prepared properly. If you don't cook steroids long enough, they don't transition from powder into liquid, he explained. It means your gear is crashed.
Do you have you had friends who cook their own steroids?
Still, Nick stuck with them and gradually added other compounds. He rattled off some of the drugs he tried during his career with such familiarity they sounded like underground hardcore bands. Anavar, D-Ball, MPP. At times, depending on the compound, he was shooting every day, 1,000+ milligrams per week.
People want these big, dramatic external solutions to what's at core an internal lack of ease with oneself that then translates into a lack of ease with other people, which translates into loneliness. And then the more disconnected you get from other people, the more delusional you become, and you have to build up some artificial sense of self because your real self is so disappointing. So you get on PEDs, or you get into narcissism, or you get into religion, or you get into radical politics.
And he grew muscle, lots of it. And he also grew paranoid and felt extremely lethargic outside the gym. And yet, the second you touch a weight, you're a god. I was gaining 20, 40 pounds on my bench press every 2 to 3 weeks. It was madness. Meanwhile, one of the drugs turned his sweat yellow, also his semen. His hairline receded and he switched to a mohawk. This is the progression of bodybuilders: full hair, mohawk, bald. Plus, he experienced such bad acne he started going to a tanning salon multiple times a week, mainly to roast his back. Eventually, Nick started making his own gear, partly to save money, but also to make money. A single bottle of steroids cost him about $6 to produce, and he could sell it for $50 to $90. Unfortunately, cooking wasn't easy. The first batch bubbled over in the kitchen. By that...
Okay, so people are looking for salvation. In a religious age, people would find salvation in Christianity. At the time of the Renaissance, people found salvation in reading. Now some people find salvation in various live stream communities. But these are all external solutions for what is at core an internal problem. Just going to play just a couple more minutes from Decoding the Gurus on Žižek.
It was just about, it just got me thinking about these transgressive rituals, and just I was trying to think of concrete examples. Is there any, like, to make it, see if there's some truth to it to me? And it made me think of the communion in the Catholic Church, which has always seemed odd to me, right? Because you have the situation where the parishioners all kneel down, and the priest sticks a little piece of bread, a wafer, in each of their mouths, which they then are told is transmitted into the body of Christ, which they then go on to eat, right? So just on the face of it, right, it's transgressive in multiple ways, right? You shouldn't be eating people. And adults sticking food into other people's mouths, it's not really done. You might feed a baby like that, but it's not something that you do to a person. And do you think, would you, you're a scientific sort of scholar of these kinds of things, do you see some truth in that? That these transgressive rituals are kind of necessary and important to the broader ideology? I don't know.
Yeah, there is a thing called liminal rituals, which Victor Turner was talking about. And it's a little bit different, that concept, but it's talking about how there's various rituals where status is inverted. The lower status individuals are able to mock the higher status individuals and all this. And this serving as like a kind of release of pent-up social frustration, or, you need these transgressive acts in order to solidify social harmony, especially when they're in like quite hierarchical settings and this kind of thing. So that is certainly, I think, well attested to, at least in a certain category of rituals. But that's a bit different than this concept, because this is talking about, in the case of like the Catholic.
So one of Chris Kavanaugh's specialties is, why do people engage in group rituals that hurt, such as fasting among Jews, or other rituals that hurt? And the reason is that it creates a strong bond with other people. You feel less alone in the world. So, I mean, I start every day with a cold shower. I don't look forward to a cold shower, but everything after that cold shower is easier, right? My day just gets easier after the first 5 minutes.
Eucharist. I feel that you could view that as a transgressive ritual, but it's one that's been neutered almost entirely, because like now there was and is a theology around that which justifies it, but it's also not really taken in any way as a transgressive act now, right? Like it's been ritualized to the point of there's nobody at a mass like kind of going, oh, I'm eating the blood of Christ, right?
Yeah, like it doesn't have that frisson, right? No, I take your point.
But it has, however, that point has not escaped the notice of like Protestant theologians, right?
I can imagine.
Yeah, because one of the issues is like the transubstantiation doctrine in the debates between the different sects of Christianity, like whether transubstantiation actually occurs or whether it's do this in memory of me, right? Like it's just a ritual reenactment of a ceremony that Jesus did at the Last Supper, right? So
yeah, it can be a bit like reading meaning into the shark, I think is what you're saying. You made me think about those transgressive things, and as a relieving of tension and friction. Like a good example would be like the stereotypical jester in the court of a king, right? Henry VIII type king. You know what I mean? He's the one person who's allowed to be disrespectful. He's allowed to do whatever, and everyone has a good laugh. And he might go too far sometimes and get his head cut off. But I guess it's a broad brush, though, isn't it? Or it's a reach to then say that's the same thing as the he'd probably point to like the illegal activities of intelligence agencies or covert military operations in a democratic society is necessary to the ideology because it goes against the ideology, but it's necessary. And it just seems like a very different thing, I guess. You made me.
Well, there's also there's an anthropology article, quite famous one by Marvin and Ingle, that was talking about military service and the nation state as operating through blood sacrifice, like its legitimacy being achieved by the fact that soldiers are willing to die for the defense of the nation, and this not being presented as like a ritual sacrifice, but it has very many of the elements that have, right? And I think in that respect, it's all in the way that you frame things, because there is a way in which being capable of having members of your society willing to die to protect the laws and the rulers of your society can be framed as a blood sacrifice, right? And there are ways that nation states do things which are transgressive of their values, but at the same time are potentially reinforcing their power to project their values.
Yeah. And that's my thing. If I imagine Jordan Peterson saying these things and talking about it as being a blood sacrifice and stuff, I'd be like, no. Like a simpler explanation for the existence of covert military operations and MI5 and stuff like that is that it's like a practical necessity, hypocritical though it might be to the purported principles.
Yeah. But I think you can get more out of seeing there are various things that like nation states and secular institutions do, which are pure pageantry or completely hypocritical of their stated values. And the pure pageantry thing would be an inauguration ceremony. Why do you have to have that? And why do you have to have these rituals performed? Why do you have oaths have to be sworn in a specific way, right? Like Obama didn't say one line right, and he needed to say it right the next day. And did people think if he didn't say that exactly right, that the power had not transferred, right? Like obviously not, but the ritual was important. So there's that aspect, and then there's the fact that various countries, the US chief amongst them, go around promoting democracy and the rule of law, but famously have taken various geopolitical moves where they've supported despotic regimes when it suited their national interests. And it's absolutely true. And there are analyses, I think, that you can do of that from philosophical points of view or more interpretive things, which are compelling. But like you said, I think a lot of it comes down to, okay, but are there less flowery interpretations that also fit the evidence? And oftentimes the answer is yes. So I guess I don't know enough about his transgressive act thing to see it, but there certainly are transgressive acts in terms of inconsistencies, right? In all societies and ideologies. So sure.
That's fair. I like that answer. That's good. Okay.
Well, we'll move to an example of Zizek breaking taboos.
Ukraine needs our...
Okay, 140. That's 2 hours and 20 minutes. All right, let's get
makes these leaps. He has the problems which lots of philosophers have, where they're very good at thought experiments and, like we just heard, giving good illustrative examples and making you think through things. But also, they don't really approach things in a scientific
or an evidence-based way. They don't.
No. So they don't. Disconfirming example.
Yeah, it does seem like, in general, philosophers primarily go from their own feelings. Right? They don't pursue things on an evidence basis.
Especially in his cultural, interpretive stuff is not there. But he wouldn't claim otherwise, I don't think. So I appreciate him for what he is. I like just the incongruous nature of him, snuffling around the stage beside Jordan Peterson in a suit. And he's clearly a very smart guy. There's clear depth to him. And, you can agree or disagree with his positions. But I think that's the point that, he's perfectly fine with that. And he likes, posing questions of, he to me is kind of what philosophers are supposed to be in a way. I don't take much issue, even though, it depends which version of his politics you land on. But he would certainly not say he's just a moderate liberal person. But I don't find him very objectionable and lots of the things he advocates for. So maybe that makes me a moderate conservative communist.
There you go. We're Marxists too. So that would be better rather than making him out to be annoying and frustrating and things, just mainly those waffly leaks, the cultural criticism and analyzing movies in that way. I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't mind people doing it recreationally, but I don't think you can build a philosophy out of those sorts of observations. On the other hand, when I did some reading about his philosophy and, it all seemed kind of fine and relatively interesting. A lot of the time, like we got to at the end here, he's just a guy with opinions. He's doing social commentary, he's doing political commentary, he's answering questions about what do you think's going to happen next and what do you think about this issue, and the answers he gives are quite good ones. So I wouldn't be concerned if your younger brother was a fan of Slavoj Žižek, was into Zizek. He's cool. He's all right.
Yeah, well, but I think he does come close to fitting the secular
Oh, yes.
guru mode in a whole bunch of different ways.
There are a few red flags. Sorry to interrupt, Chris, but I'm sure you'll think of more. But one of the ones was, of course, this making out that everyone hates him, that he's an iconoclast, that he's just, you know, and like I just haven't encountered much Zizek hate out there. Like there's a lot of Destiny hate out there. I mean, well, he's someone who can claim that he's roundly hated by many people. But Zizek, have you seen it? Are there Zizek haters?
I mean, he does get controversy from time to time for statements he made. Like I seen a clip of him saying the N-word, a bit like Destiny, in a way. Like, yeah, but I think it is true to say he's loved by a wide array of people. And I mean, Jacobin just did a big in-depth article in this new book and was like, you know, you shouldn't not take Zizek seriously, right? And it's a book which is calling for an atheist Christianity or secular Christianity or whatever. So like, yeah, I think he is more popular than he likes to let on. But yeah, that's fine. He likes being an iconoclast. And that is a part of the secular guru pose, you know, presenting ideas which are not that revolutionary as being, you know, dramatic and...
I just find that tiresome.
Hugely significant. But, you know, these are relatively minor sins. And I think he does have interesting ideas, interesting takes, something novel perspectives. And so, you know, he's an intellectual and he's a cultural critic and he's a philosopher. And
yeah, I just find him incredibly annoying. All right, talking about critical race theory, Dr. Delgado, Richard Delgado, Mexican-American legal scholar in Seattle, just paving the way for some kind of racial war.
Is embedded in our thought processes and social structures and institutions of society. So only aggressive color, conscious efforts to change the way things are, will do much to ameliorate misery. Using this kind of language when every conceivable nonviolent means, including again flat-out unconstitutional anti-white discrimination, has already been attempted and failed to produce Delgado's desired power shift, indicates that Delgado probably has force in mind. And nowhere in his book does he say otherwise. Most tellingly, CRT's potential for causing anti-white violence can be found in Delgado's earlier work, as well as that of other CRT co-founders like Harvard professor Derek Bell, which shows that he has been contemplating this kind of crime for decades, specifically in counterstories published in prestigious law review journals. Counterstories, a major element of CRT, are either fictional or non-fictional deep dives into a minority writer's own thinking and/or background, which reveals some purported societal inequity that the biased dominant white narrative supposedly overlooks. But often enough, they avoid intellectually rigorous analysis that would not to support the author's biases and preconceptions. In one of Delgado's counterstories, Rodrigo's third chronicle, Rodrigo, a fictional mixed-race black Italian-American law student who Delgado refers to as his alter ego, has recently gotten back from a trip to his native Italy and is complaining to Delgado that civil rights laws are not working because whites think of blacks as beyond love. Delgado, as a man of color, sympathetically agrees, and Rodrigo proposes a frighteningly aggressive solution. Rodrigo: it's easier to think of what the new form of coercion would be. It must come from us, not from them, at least initially. I think it would be some form of what your society calls terrorism or sabotage. Surely the most perceptive among your white friends know that continued neglect can only cause more violence, more frustration, more uprisings like those in New York and Los Angeles. Delgado: a few of us have dared to breach that suggestion, but unlike you, we have tenure. Giving consideration to such ideas and then citing them 30 years later is dangerous and irresponsible. Anti-white violence is a plausible result of Delgado's advocacy of crime, paired with his obsessive and irrational focus on white racism as a cause of unequal racial outcomes. And he flat-out rejects the obvious possibility that unequal racial outcomes substantially result from biological differences.
So please rejoice. I have renewed my subscription to the New York Review of Books. Terrific series of essays in the latest issue. One is called The Tower and the Sewer by Mark Lila. Catholic post-liberal thinkers opposed to modern liberal individualism are less interested in transforming people's unhappy lives through the power of the Christian gospel than in jockeying for political power as the vanguard of a conservative revolution. Well, people will tend to gravitate towards that which gives them the most power and status and access to sex with attractive young women. Right? That tends to be the thing that drives men into public life. Now, liberalism is a pretty good system of government in many circumstances, all right? This idea that individuals have certain inalienable rights, and it's the purpose of government to enforce and protect those rights. Right? The Declaration of Independence, U.S. Constitution, all right? Pretty good documents, right? I think the general history of the United States has been awesome. However, we replaced effectively the original Constitution with a new Civil Rights Constitution starting in the 1960s, and we gave away large parts of our freedom to own property and do with it as we will, and freedom of association, and we opened ourselves up to a litigious and vengeful society. So white people thought they were doing something sweet and kind and nice and Christian when they supported civil rights, but black people in particular thought that civil rights meant that white people were admitting that they were guilty of being horrible. And so whites and blacks reacted to civil rights legislation in completely different ways. Once you had the first major civil rights bill passed in 1965, you then had a huge outbreak in criminal violence that has never fully receded. Right, great article here, Mark. Lila. On an overcast morning in the late 1980s, I visited the church across the way from my apartment in Paris. I was curious. The parish was then the headquarters of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a schismatic opponent of the Vatican II reforms, who had just been excommunicated by Pope John Paul II. So conservative Catholics from all over the city squeezed into the church on Sundays to hear Gregorian chants and the Tridentine Mass recited in Latin, a beautiful, forbidden experience. After the service, a number of congregants gathered in the church's small courtyard to chat and to leaf through some of the right-wing books and newspapers that had been laid out on folding tables. When I hovered over one of them, a young man behind it mentioned a shop where I could find more books in the same vein. Remember the thrill of discovering bookshops? When I would travel as a kid, the destination number one for me was bookshops, and I loved to get more of the Just William series, right? Just William book series. I wanted to get more and more of these books. All right, they would chronicle the adventures of the unruly schoolboy William Brown. They were published over a period of 50 years between 1922 and 1970. I probably read about 40 of these books. They were written by an English author, Richmond Crompton. So William Brown is a middle-class schoolboy of 11, and I just love these books. So wherever we'd go, all right, I'd go to bookstores and try to find cheap books. And I'm ashamed of one thing I did when I didn't like the price at one bookstore. It was like $7.50 for a Just William book. I licked my finger and I rubbed out the price, and then I asked the clerk for how much the book was. Oh, not a very good sign about my character. So I was 11 years of age at the time. So this young man tips him off where he can find more right-wing books. He tears off a scrap of paper, writes down an address, tells me the bookstore has no sign because there had been arson attempts at earlier locations and that I should just knock on the door. So I go, I knock, I'm given the once-over, and then I'm admitted. So I pass through a thick crimson drape, and I discover a jumble of overstuffed bookcases lining the walls of a big room. And turned out there was order in the disorder. The collection had been laid out chronologically according to the French Right's conflicting historical obsession. So the first bookcase is devoted to the neo-paganism of the Nouvelle Droite, the New Right, which since the 1960s has been inspired by the writer and editor Alain de Benoit. His 1981 book On Being a Pagan is considered one of its foundational texts. So this group is the most radical, if the smallest force on the European right, because it places Eden so far back in time that it blames the advent of Christianity 2 millennia ago for Europe's relentless decline. Next bookcase contains histories extolling Christianity's victory over paganism and pining for the simple harmony of the monastic Middle Ages. So if you are not a liberal, right, if you are right of center, then to varying extents, you are medieval in your outlook on life, right? So as opposed to the modern secular humanist liberal notion that we can have a buffered identity where we're buffered, so if there's, dastardly things going on next door. That doesn't have to affect us because we have the individual capability of creating our own meaning and morality in life. So that's what it means to have the Buffett identity. But from a medieval perspective, that is absurd. Of course, what's going on next door affects me. My most cited quote on the internet is everything we do affects other people. So another part of the medieval outlook is that there are special people and regular people. There are special places and regular places, right? There are special rituals that the world is imbued with varying degrees of significance, as opposed to the Protestant and secularized Protestantism, which is woke culture that we all can overcome, all material circumstances and develop meaning and morality just through the force of our own rational faculties. So next bookcase finds lush volumes celebrating the grandeur of the Catholic House of Bourbon. Then you've got bookcases given over the catastrophe of the French Revolution. We've got hagiographies of the counter-revolutionary uprisings. Then farther down the aisle are all these strongly anti-German books focused on the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, which the Germans won. Then after that, you've got a bookcase filled with anti-Dreyfusard works, right? All these books proving that even if Alfred Dreyfus wasn't a German agent, right? Dreyfus was a Jew, then at least his supporters were. And then next bookcase, you find phylogenetic biographies of Nazi generals like Erwin Rommel and books about heroic Vichy collaborators, right? Then you got another bookcase on angry books on the French Algeria, which France abandoned ruling Algeria in the 1960s. Then you've got memoirs by officers who resisted the French withdrawal from Algeria and in retribution tried to assassinate French President Charles de Gaulle in 1962. Then the last bookcase contains attacks on the student rebels of May 1968 who also wanted to oust Charles de Gaulle, though for different reasons. And then at the end, on the floor next to the cash register is a wire bin filled with cassettes of racist heavy metal music by bands with German names. So it's a movable feast of right-wing thought and music. So the author says here in the New York Review of Books, it's always been more difficult to make sense of the radical right than the radical left. I don't think so. All right, to be on the right means that your greatest fear is contamination and disorder, and that you prefer traditional ways of doing things as opposed traditional ways of organizing families and communities, as opposed to the left, which believes in trying innovative new ways of organizing families and is opposed to hierarchy and wants to try new things. And the left's biggest fear is ignorance and bigotry. So as opposed to the serious left-wing bookshops that catered to active socialists, right, the right seems helter-skelter, right? So on the left, you've got utopian authors rubbing shoulders with Stalinists, anarchists with Trotskyists. You got devotees of the chairman Mao with interpreters of the wisdom of the Albanian leader Enver Hoxha. You remember him? That's 1970s things, right? So you got shelves devoted to all these different types of post-colonial liberation movements. But despite all the intellectual and geographic variety, right, the authors are aiming at the same abstract goal, a future of human emancipation into a state of freedom and equality. But what's the goal of those on the radical right? That's harder to discern. Contemporary life is compared to a half-imagined lost world that inspires and limits reflection about possible future. So there are many different paths that inspire the militant nostalgia of the various factions of the right. So you might think that the political right is hopelessly fractious. But remember the days of live streaming back in 2016, 2017, 2018, and all the different types of the dissident right were talking to each other. Right now, it's possible right now you can attend right-wing conferences and you get speakers who are national conservatives, who are enamored of the Peace of Westphalia. Isn't that from the 17th century? You've got secular populists enamored of 19th century American President Andrew Jackson. You've got paleo-Catholics enamored of the 5th century Christian church. You've got gun lovers enamored of the 19th century Wild West. You've got hawks enamored of the 20th century Cold War. You've got isolationists enamored of the America First movement prior to the Second World War. And you've got acne young men waving around thick manifestos by preposterous figure known as Bronze Age pervert, and they all get along. So yeah, back in 2016, 2017, 2018, we could all talk to each other on live streams. So why do the various components of the far right all get along? Because they all have these usable paths that serve more as symbolic hieroglyphs for the right than as actual models for orienting action. So they go in and out of faction unpredictably, depending on changes in circumstance, changes in the political and intellectual climate. So the further right one goes, the greater conviction there is that a decisive historical break is to blame for our loathsome present, that accelerating decline must be met with, well, something. That's when things get vague. And that's absolutely true. Right? The further right you go, and people I talk to, the more and more is there a absolute loathing for the present. All right? The more right-wing people are, the more they just cannot stand our present world, and they more and more likely to talk about America as a more repressive place than North Korea and other such absurd things. Or downhill after cultivating fire, says Clip Medley. So rhetorical vagueness is a powerful political weapon, right? Jesus, past revolutionary, he likened the kingdom of God to a leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. Right, not terribly enlightening, but not terribly contentious either. Right, Marx and Engels spoke of a post-revolutionary communist society where one could hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and write angry manifestos at night. After that, they let the matter drop. So maintaining vagueness about the future is what allows people on the American right with completely different views, including completely different views of the past, to share an illusory sense of common purpose for the future. So how should we try to understand the radical right today? Well, until the election of Donald Trump, generally speaking, people in the center and on the left, particularly journalists, had no interest in embedding in far-right groups. Scholars had no interest in engaging seriously with far-right ideas, and anyone who looked into these matters was greeted with suspicion by both their left-wing peers and by right-wing groups. Today, you've got journalists covering many important right-wing groups and movements. They do a fairly good job of plumbing the depths of right-wing internet chatter. Right, but keeping up with the trends is not the same as understanding what they signify. So what so often seems lacking in our reporting is alertness to the psychodynamics of ideological commitments. I remember I had a friend in Orthodox Judaism, and I decided in 1998 that I wanted to go to psychotherapy with her. She had a master's in social work. She was a licensed clinical social worker and did therapy. And I asked her, what type of therapy do you do? And she said psychodynamic. So as I understand it, that's the type of therapy that is most like psychoanalysis. And so I worked with her on and off for 4 years. So what the hell is
70s, thermodynamics were a hot topic. No pun intended. It explained energy and heat in a way that made sense, and it drastically advanced the field of physics. Everybody was talking about it, and everybody wanted a piece of it. And one particular scientist at the University of Vienna named Ernst Wilhelm von Bruck thought to himself,
well, wait a second. If these laws dictate our entire world, then aren't all living beings, including humans, just bodies of energy that would also abide by these laws?
Ernst published his theory in 1874, which was a significant year because it was the same year that he began advising a bright, young first-year medical student, Albert Einstein. I'm just kidding, it's Sigmund Freud. Freud really liked von Bruck's theory, so he stole it and took it a step further. He surmised that not only do the laws of thermodynamics apply to the human body, but they also apply to the human psyche. Voila! Psychodynamic theory was born. A lot of early psychologists became founders and devotees to this theory, including Freud himself and Carl Jung. And it became the basis for the first talk therapy techniques, including psychoanalysis. If you're interested in learning more about psychoanalysis, then check out my video for more on that. Around the same time, a boy named Alfred Adler was born to a Jewish grain merchant and his wife. Alfred developed rickets at a young age and was not able to walk until he was 4 years old. His healthy older brother was showered with attention, while his mother had very little patience for Alfred's needs. At one point, he developed pneumonia, and the doctor told his father, "Your boy is lost." But Alfred beat the odds. He recovered from his afflictions, grew strong, and became fiercely competitive with his older brother. Little did Alfred know, his illness and sibling rivalry would lead him to develop an entirely new form of mental health treatment: psychodynamic therapy. Before we dive in, let's answer a very important question. What do we mean when we say psychodynamic therapy? Often psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapy are used as interchangeable terms, but they're quite different. And a lot of people like Anna Freud and Melanie Klein developed different flavors of this technique based on different interpretations of the human psyche. But Alfred Adler stands out as the first and most prominent psychodynamic theorist whose impact continues to this day. As such, today I'll be focusing on Adlerian.
Okay, you've been such a lovely audience that I am going to give you some hate porn. Just a little bit, because it's not good for you, but it's just a little bit.
Thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, also known as CABLE. We'll be focusing our comments on Division 35 of Bill 69, the proposed amendment to the Criminal Code for auto theft. CABLE appreciates the concerns about the rising levels of auto theft in our communities. However, we do not believe that the proposed amendments will make our communities safer. There's an immense amount of research that shows that harsher penalties are ineffective in deterring crime. Policies rooted in the belief that a tough-on-crime approach will reduce crime rates are without empirical support. What there is evidence of is that these policies have a disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities who are already overrepresented in the criminal legal system.
Whoa, isn't that racist to say that these communities are particularly prone to crime? All right, I'm having such a good time with you that I'm going to give you a little bit more hate porn. Just a few minutes, so don't go crazy here.
Biden himself from lying directly to you, the American people, in the weeks leading up to the 2020 election. And of course, it was censored by big tech and the media mob as well. They echoed Joe's lie. Take a look.
There are 50 former national intelligence folks who said that what he's accusing me of is a Russian plant. They have said that this has all the five former heads of the CIA, both parties, say what he's saying is a bunch of garbage. Nobody believes it except his and his good friend Rudy Giuliani.
You mean the laptop is now another Russia hoax?
That's exactly what.
Is this
that's
where you
exactly
go?
what.
This is where.
Do you believe the recent leak of material allegedly from Hunter's computer is part of a Russian disinformation campaign?
From what I've read and know, the intelligence community warned the president that Giuliani was being fed disinformation from the Russians. And we also know that Putin is trying very hard to spread disinformation about Joe Biden. And so when you put the combination of Russia, Giuliani, the president together, it's just what it is. It's a smear campaign.
Still think that the stories from the fall about your son Hunter were Russian disinformation and a smear campaign, like you said?
Yes. God love you, man. You're a one-horse pony, I tell you.
Wasn't just Joe. Here's the media mob that claimed to be journalists spreading that misinformation lie of Russian conspiracy theory. By the way, after 3 years of lies and conspiracy theories. Why? They did it to help him win an election, and that might be called election interference. Take a look.
Does it surprise you at all that this information Rudy Giuliani is peddling very well could be connected to some sort of Russian government disinformation campaign?
Well, we know that this whole smear on Joe Biden comes from the Kremlin. That's been clear for well over a year now.
To me, this is just classic textbook Soviet-Russian tradecraft at work.
U.S. authorities are seeing if those emails we just talked about are connected to an ongoing Russian disinformation effort.
It is so obviously
a Russian operation.
Hunter Biden, this laptop that intelligence officials have warned is likely Russian disinformation.
For all we know, these emails are made up, or maybe some are real and others are fakes. We don't know. But we do know that this is a classic example of the right-wing media machine.
It's broadly known and widely known, Peter, that there was a broad range of Russian disinformation back in 2020.
There was a time before this election you'd be banned from Twitter, Facebook, social media for even sharing the New York Post's correct Hunter Biden laptop story in a private message, all with a wink and a nod from what, the FBI that was meeting in the weeks leading up to 2020 with big tech. The level of
Okay, that's all the hate porn that you're going to get. All right, so you've been good. I gave you a little hate porn. Now I need you to eat your vegetables. All right, back to the New York Review of Books. I like this description of the psychodynamics of ideological commitment. So our political and ideological and religious commitments, all right, they also have a component that simply resonates in our emotions. The great political novelists of the past, Dostoevsky, Conrad, Thomas Mann, created protagonists who make coherent ideological arguments that other characters engage with seriously, that also reveal something significant about their psychological makeup, right? These authors wrote the way good psychoanalysts practice their art in the consulting room. So analysts do not dismiss the reasons we give for what we feel and believe, right? These reasons might contain a good deal of truth. They're just not waiting for a gotcha moment when our real base motives appear and our stated reasons can be dismissed, right? That's a common excuse for not paying attention to the right in politics, right? So a good psychoanalyst looks at us through two different lenses. One, as an inquiring creature who sometimes finds the truth. And second, we are also self-deceiving creatures whose searches are willfully incomplete, revealingly repetitive, emotionally charged, and often self-undermining. So we need to use this same type of analysis with the leading ideological movements of our time. So sometimes people say the truth, sometimes we say the truth. Frequently, however, what we say is incomplete, if not a lie, emotionally charged, and often self-undermining. So for the author of this New York Review of Books, his favorite stream of American right-wing thought today is Catholic post-liberalism, also called common good conservatism. So the purpose of politics is to increase the common good. The post in post-liberalism means a rejection of the intellectual foundations of modern liberal individualism. So the focus is not on a narrow set of political principles such as rights, right? The focus of liberalism is on the individual and his rights, right? So post-liberals, by contrast, prize autonomy, and they are indifferent to the psychological and social effects of radical individualism. Is that true? No, I think the opposite, right? The post-liberals think that there's something more important than the individual, and that is the well-being of the people, the group, or the tribe. So this right-wing outlook is hostile to the notion of natural limits, moral limits to individual action. No, I don't believe this is correct. But anyway, Catholic post-liberals want to establish a more communitarian vision of the good society. Yes, see, the focus of the post-liberals is not on the individual, it's on the community, right? And that's the focus in traditional Judaism, not on individuals, it's on the community. So in this Catholic post-liberal vision, democratic institutions would be subordinate to a superior authoritative moral vision of the human good, which for many means the authority of the Catholic Church. No, I think for post-liberals on the right, the highest good is the good of the particular people, the nation, the tribe. And what's good for the nation, the people, the tribe, will depend upon circumstance. But the purpose of a constitution and of law and of a state and of an economy is to serve a particular people in a particular place. It's not to fulfill abstract principles of liberalism or any other ideology. Right, back to an examination of critical race theory.
Stubbornly insisting on the continued deconstruction of race so that biological theories of inferiority and hierarchy cannot ever rise again. However, true to fashion, Delgado contradicts himself by presenting a classroom exercise in the very last paragraph of the book that poses the same question for student consideration. Will the Human Genome Project show that the eugenicists and race IQ researchers were at least partly right?
Do you think people will still be watching replays of these live streams in 10 years, 50 years, 500 years? And does the awesome majesty of this show compel you to match it with the way that you dress when you watch this show? Asking for a friend.
And that real, non-trivial differences do mark the races. Evidently, it is okay to discuss this idea in high schools and universities without being cancelled, as long as the left holds a monopoly on the discussion. Elsewhere in Delgado's fever dreams, as in his 1996 book, The Coming Race War, he expresses paranoid suspicions that whites will try to end racial preference programs to deliberately provoke people of color to rise up.
Imagine if somebody on the right published a book called The Coming Race War and how they would be treated in the news media. So Mark Lila writes here in the New York Review of Books, he says that these post-liberal students I meet feel the hollowness of contemporary culture. So in all likelihood, these students who have become post-liberal and are on this dramatic political, ideological, and religious journey to the right, the hollowness of contemporary culture is not really what's primarily going on for them. I suspect it's primarily a hollowness in their own soul, right? If you are embarked on a search for meaning, that means you lack ordinary human connection, right? If you've got a spouse and children, right, all the meaning that you should need is right there. But he says these particular students, that they feel the hollowness of contemporary culture, which is now heightened by the ephemeral, yet fraught online relations that they have with others. Yeah, if your primary relationships with other people is online, there's something wrong. And so if you're spending a disproportionate amount of on time and your most important relations are online, then there's something wrong with the way you lead your real life. And so to try to cover up the hole that comes from an inadequate sense of connection with other people in real life, right? People embark on all sorts of exciting, dramatic journeys to try to distract oneself from the misery inside. So one can understand their romantic infatuation with notion of Catholic tradition and its intellectual heritage, which promise structure and spiritual depth. Something similar is happening to Jewish students drawn to Orthodox Judaism. Yeah, those who lack ordinary human ties go on these dramatic journeys, and then you go on this dramatic journey, but it doesn't solve the problem, right? It just shifts the location where you're living out your problems, but you will just take yourself with you no matter what religion you convert to. So they are highly susceptible of dreams of returning to pre-modern Christian social teaching, which they think will create a more decent and just society and more meaningful personal lives for themselves. Again, they're on this search for meaning because they lack human connection. And so they have all these fantasies about how, Judaism or Christianity or this type of politics, all right, or that type of endeavor or yoga will meet, this gaping hole I've got inside.
Which will give whites a pretext to set the headbangers on them and then take control of the country. One of the most contentious points in the CRT debate concerns whether or not its extremist ideas are being taught in K-12 schools. On PS6, Delgado observes that critical race ideas in K-12 schools have come under sharp attack. Without any clarification, this is an odd assertion for a writer who, as we shall see, later takes the inconsistent position that CRT is not taught in K-12 schools.
All right, back to the New York Review of Books, and the author says it seems far-fetched to imagine the right wing making a long mark through America's institutions, but now Trump activists are preparing to battle against the deep state should Trump be elected again. The Heritage Foundation has developed Project 2025, which created a database of roughly 20,000 trusted right-wingers who could be appointed to government positions immediately in a second Trump administration. And the author says this notion of social change having to come from the top is in the Catholic tradition a very papal one. So the post-liberals writing today are papists in spirit, right? And they almost never speak about the power of the gospel to transform society from below by first transforming the inner lives of its members. So saving souls is just a retail business, not a wholesale one. Has nothing to do with jockeying for political power in a fallen world. Right? Ministering to souls requires patience, charity, and humility. Means meeting other people where they are and persuading them that there's a better way of living. Jesus implored his disciples to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And some of these post-liberals counsel people to adopt Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends. Right? Montaigne had a wise remark: it is much easier to talk like Aristotle and to live like Caesar than to talk and live like Socrates. So faith may move mountains, but too slowly for these horsemen of the apocalypse. And the author credits the post-liberals with getting a number of things right. There is a malaise, call it cultural or spiritual or psychological, among Western societies, reflected most of all in the worrisome state of our children, who are ever more depressed and suicidal. So he's giving them points. We do lack adequate politics for articulating and defending the common good and placing necessary limits on individual autonomy. But seen from another perspective, the post-liberals offer just one more example of the psychology of self-induced ideological hysteria, right? So if you're coming from an unstable place, right, if you don't have a life that works, right, if you're not able to relate to people in another way, you're highly predisposed, if you're intelligent, to seek out ideological hysterias that will distract you from the wretched refuse of your own life. So self-induced ideological hysterias begin with the identification of a genuine problem, then they quickly mutate into a sense of world historical crisis, and then the appointment of oneself and one's comrades as the select to go out there and deliver divine karma and strike down the adversary. So as long as their focus is on culture wars rather than spreading the Christian gospel, these Catholics will inevitably meet with disappointment in post-Protestant secular America. And the author concludes, my concern is for the young people drawn to the movement today. Their unhappiness with the lonely, superficial, unstable lives our culture and economy offer does them credit. No, it doesn't do them credit. This is where I disagree. Right? If you're lonely and you feel like your life is superficial and unstable, in all likelihood, that has almost nothing to do with America and almost everything to do with you. Right? Most Americans are not leading lonely, superficial, or unstable lives. Finding the true source of our disquiet is never a simple matter. Yeah, the true source of our disquiet is inside. It's a lack of ease with ourselves, which then translates into uneasy relations with others. And it's much easier, I agree with the author, to be enchanted by historical fairy tales and to join a partisan political sect promising redemption from the present than it is to reconcile oneself to never being fully reconciled with life as it is. If I were a believer and called to preach a sermon to them, I would tell them to continue cultivating their minds and their souls and to leave Washington to the Caesars of this world. So, pretty good essay here in the latest New York Review of Books. All right, back to Aporia Magazine critiquing critical race theory.
But Delgado is using the word ideas here, not theory, without explaining why. The phrase critical race ideas only appears 3 times in the book, and all on the same page. Jumping ahead to pp 104-105, Delgado writes, readers of this book, and anyone who has attended a K-12 school in recent years, know that critical race theory is a law school or graduate-level class hardly ever taught in the early years. In a limited sense, there is no inconsistency in this denial, as now he is using theory instead of ideas. Yet there are many academic subjects like mathematics whose basic foundations are taught in the K-12 years and whose more advanced concepts are reserved for post-secondary education. Scholars and teachers normally feel no need to use deception to hide their curriculum development plans, except when obfuscating their true aims, that is, radical ideological brainwashing. Regardless, in a sloppy admission on pp 68-69, Delgado gives the game away. Right in the middle of a discussion of Black and Latino nationalism within the CRT movement, he explicitly states that his book was used in a K-12 curriculum. At the high school level, a Latino studies program in at least one district in Tucson, Arizona drew the ire of state officials. School officials removed a number of the program's texts, which included Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed and the very book you are reading from the shelves of the classrooms in front of crying students. After a long struggle, the students and their backers prevailed. Gonzalez v. Douglas, 269 F. Sup. 3 D. 948. D. Ariz, 2019. After all, who can resist a good boast? On PWA 21, we find Delgado preaching the idea that white men rarely act out of any sense of goodwill. Civil rights gains for communities of color coincide with the dictates of white self-interest. Little happens out of altruism alone. While it has not always been smooth sailing, the fact that much of the white establishment has for generations willingly shared power is hardly mentioned. Ignoring the goodwill of white people denies an essential aspect of their humanity and raises the suspicion that they are malevolent self-dealers.
Okay, that'll do it for tonight. Take care. Talk to you.